And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this India Today election pop-up special here in Mumbai. The next 2 weeks, all eyes will be on Kaun Banega Pradhan Mantri, who will be the Prime Minister, who will form the next government. But also, a keen eye will be kept on the economy and the markets in particular, and how these elections could affect India's market fundamentals. So at a time when Modi and markets, both the M's are in the focus, we're very privileged to be joined by a very special guest, best-selling author. He's out with a new book that we'll be speaking about, ace investor, political and economic trend spotter par excellence. Ruchir Sharma is with us here all the way from New York. Thanks very much, Ruchir, for joining us. Please give him a very big hand, ladies and gentlemen. Ruchir, in fact, is ideally placed from his vantage point to tell us not just what he foresees happening on the 4th of June, but Ruchir, what happens even beyond that to the economy, how the markets might react to the political churn. So I'm going to start, Ruchir, with a recent piece I read after your travels, and you've traveled extensively, including through Maharashtra, which you headlined, "You don't see a wave, you only see a heat wave." And this has led some to believe, is Ruchir Sharma suggesting that this election is far more competitive than 2019, a localized state-by-state contest, and this 400 par slogan of the BJP is hype. Is that how we should interpret a seemingly waveless election?
Yeah, Rajdeep, I think that's broadly correct, which is that now, once again, we all have to be modest about it, because having done 32 election trips over the last 25 years, and we sit down at the end of the trip, there were 20 of us who traveled together and have kept this tradition on for a long period of time. We broadly get the direction correct, but there's no way we can predict seats in terms of what happens. This time when we went out there, the broad direction, and remember, I wrote my column in the Financial Times 8 weeks ago, in which I had said that this is possibly the most predictable election that I have seen in terms of it, because all the opinion polls, everyone, the entire chorus then was that this is so predictable, right? That's what the entire thing was. So I began a column that way. Then we begin this election trip. We drive 2,000 kilometers all the way from the east to the west coast, Vijayawada to Mumbai, stop on the way at many places. And more than that, just speaking to stringers everywhere, right? Journalists, stringers everywhere. The feeling that I came away with at the end of the trip is that this is at least much more competitive than it appeared 8 weeks ago. So there was a big change in terms of the feedback that we picked up from the ground from each state. So I think that the broad direction in terms of is what we try and get, and it seems to me as if there's a big disconnect. If you look at the stock market today, you look at the Satta Bazaar today, they are predicting a frozen election. What do I mean by a frozen election? They think that the verdict is going to be unchanged compared to 2019. So the Satta Bazaar today, in fact, there are all sorts of quotes which go, but the most reliable quotes I know predict the BJP getting exactly the same number of seats as in 2019. The stock market so far has largely ignored this election. It's almost like, there's been barely any volatility, in fact. I know every time there's a 1 or 2% swing, people sort of focus on it, but that's a stock market for you. It's been very stable through it. So the markets are predicting a frozen verdict. I think there is risk to the downside based on the travels that I've done and from what I've heard and having seen elections in India over the last 25 years.
No, you've said something big already. You're saying there's a risk, a downside risk, that the predictability which you saw 8 weeks ago and wrote about no longer exists. You're saying this is far more competitive, this is far more localized, presumably. Are you suggesting that 2024 could be a repeat, as some suggest, of 2004, when all pundits were proven wrong? And I'm sure you traveled then as well. Are you seeing traces of that at all?
No, it's very hard. Now, one thing is that having done forecasting for a long period of time, and I do it for markets, I don't do it for elections so much, but I do it for a living, is like there's a great Russian proverb that I keep in mind here, which is that ignore history, you lose an eye. Focus on it too much and you lose both. So I think that what you have to keep in mind here is that every election tends to be distinct. We keep referring to 2004 or 2019, but history rarely repeats itself in such a neat fashion. All I'm trying to say is that having traveled, it seems to me as if this is a much more localized election. Even if there is no visible anti-incumbency, so this is not 2014 as you pointed out, but 2004 was such a freak event. But even in 2004, I want to caution this, which is that when I look at our track record of the group also, we went out in 2004. We came back, we wrote that this is not India shining. I wrote a whole piece on this back then, but none of us, not one person had the guts to say that the BJP would lose that election. Not one. So we just have to be modest about it, that we have covered elections. And, you know, like you speak about the exit polls as well and stuff. Just as recently as last year, not one exit poll got Chhattisgarh correct in terms of it, not one. So just have to be modest about what we see, but the broad direction is what we try and get. It's a great journey of India, and the broad direction seemed to be as if there is downside rather than upside risk from my perspective to the very strong consensus today in the market, including in the Satta Bazaar, that this is going to be a frozen verdict.
You know, what you're saying effectively seems to also mirror what a lot of foreign portfolio investors, we've seen 28,000 crores outflow in the month of May alone, 21,000 crore outflows in the month of April. Is there a seeming nervousness, anxiety at the moment, or is it just profit booking?
Yeah, I think that one of the big things about India in this entire rally or the whole India story has been foreigners have largely been absent. And this has got nothing to do with the election. In fact, despite all the talk, if you look at the foreign direct investment numbers, you look at the foreign portfolio investment numbers, they're not participating in India. If you look at the numbers. And this predates the election. So if you look at the Indian stock markets rally over the last few years, and this has been the most remarkable rally we have seen. We'll come to a separate point. India, no country in the world that I remember has seen the kind of wealth creation that India has seen in the last 5 years. But it's been entirely domestic money led. The foreign participation in this rally right from the start has been very little, but the results are quite staggering. And you know, we can segue to that later, that today, as a share of the economy, India has the highest number of billionaires of any country, major country in the world. And this has all changed in the last 5 years. But it's been entirely domestic-led. The foreign money participation in this has been minimal.
I'll come to your economic thoughts in a moment, but let's stick to the politics and your travels again.
Yes.
Because you travel through Maharashtra.
Yeah.
And many of us believe this is the swing state of 2024. If there's one state that could surprise and shock people, it could be what is happening in Maharashtra on the ground. 48 seats on offer. Did you see change in the air? Or did you just see local conflicts and a lot of chatter which may not translate into votes? And what is it that surprised you about Maharashtra? Because I read your piece and something that surprised me and I didn't know about it. Maharashtra has fallen out of the top 10 in terms of per capita income for the first time. This was India's industrial powerhouse. So something has obviously changed in a state like Maharashtra.
Yeah, so if you travel in Maharashtra, the distress is very visible. We arguably traveled in the Marathwada region, but the data sort of backed it up. Whenever I'm traveling on these trips, I always have my research people at the back end, trying to churn out data for us. So look at the state rankings of India. Maharashtra at one point in time used to be the second richest state of this country. Today, Maharashtra has fallen out of the top 10. And a lot of the decline has happened in the last 10 to 15 years. When you travel in Maharashtra, what you see is that, in fact, which is very visible, that outside of the Golden Triangle, Mumbai, Nashik and Pune, you take that out, the average income in Maharashtra is lower than the national average income of India. So, and it's been a big decline of Maharashtra. So that we saw, and we drove through places like Beed and stuff on this election trip, and the distress is visible. The quality of roads is very different in Maharashtra compared to Karnataka. The previous state we had done an election trip for was Karnataka. And the switch in fortunes is remarkable. Karnataka, no state in India has seen a rise in its per capita income like Karnataka has seen in the last 10 to 15 years, and no state has seen a decline as sharp as Maharashtra has seen in the last 10 to 15 years. So that was one of the big findings in terms of as we traveled, and the anecdotal evidence, the anger of the farmers at the ban on onion exports for which took place for about 6 months or so, on the issues like Maratha reservation and stuff. Now, what happens, unfortunately, is that whichever government is in power, now you can argue that the government may even be doing the right thing, but whichever government is in power, unfortunately, just faces the angst when you have this kind of an economic outcome in any state.
Are you seeing, therefore, anti-incumbency? Are you seeing anger? As I said, a lot of us have seen discontent. Are you seeing anger and anti-incumbency?
I don't know how to put it, but I'd say my best guess at this point in time, and when we do these trips, there are 4 kinds of things that we do, which I'm sure that even you do. One is we go to rallies and meet leaders. I personally find those things the biggest waste of time because they all give you the canned lines and it's all sort of done. The second thing we do is to sort of talk to voters by stopping every hour or so. The third thing, which I think is very interesting that we do, is that every evening I try and organize a dinner where we call local journalists, industrialists and staff to come in, talk to us. I find that the most telling in terms of the structure. The general sense I picked up, we had the dinner in Aurangabad, we had the dinner in Nashik, we had it in Solapur, is that if I speak to those people, the general sense I got was that the seat split in the state will be 50-50, but the real loss will take place in the 2 BJP allies. And I think that's a story which you may have picked up in this election as well, that with the exception of Andhra Pradesh, the BJP's allies in particular are doing very poorly in Bihar, in Karnataka, in Maharashtra. The allies are the ones which seem to be in real trouble, with the exception of Andhra Pradesh, where Chandrababu Naidu is on the ascendant.
One of the things one notices on one's trips is a sharper rural-urban divide. I know the highways now connect India much better than ever before, but you get a sense that there are multiple Indias out there. They always were there, but in a strange way, the gap seems to have even got more accentuated. I speak to all my friends here in Mumbai. Many of them are investors in the market, and they desperately want a big Modi win because they believe that's the only way the markets will consolidate and take off. Then you speak to someone in rural India, and he or she is only worried about water, about basic livelihood issues, and the 5-kilo free ration matters a lot to them. Are you seeing the emergence through all your travels over the years now of increasingly distinct, disparate Indias where the gap is actually growing, inequalities are actually widening?
Well, that gap has always been there, but as I said, in the post-COVID India in particular, and the data backs this up, the gap has really widened in terms of what's happened. Now, of course, the good thing is, which the Modi government has been able to do, is that they gave a lot of freebies, food grains, free rations and stuff like that. And the delivery mechanism has improved a lot. Because they get so much of money through direct transfers and stuff, the scope for leakage has gone down. But having said that, the gap has clearly gone up. And the urban-rural divide, the data shows this. There's a big urban-rural divide which has happened in India. And so many of these trends which were there in India have been particularly accentuated in the post-COVID world. So as I said, that the wealth and income inequality in India that is there today is at pretty much record highs. And as I said, that for me, the big telltale sign is when I look at the billionaire wealth in this country, right? The explosion in the stock market, and even there in terms of, so it's great for wealth creation. I've loved this bull market, personally. But when you go out there, you see that, yeah, this is a big factor.
Because this is part of your book, which will come to what went wrong with capitalism. Essentially, one of your thesis is that there is this huge concentration of wealth at the moment, and this is across the world, not just in India. However, as recent reports suggest, 5% of Indians account for 60% of the national wealth. Do you believe this is, in a sense, the biggest challenge for any government? Whoever comes to power on June 4th, this is going to be their big challenge. How are you going to reduce inequalities and soften and cushion those at the bottom of the pyramid without resorting to the kind of large welfare measures that most governments do?
Yeah, no, but I think that in India's case, it's a bit more complex than that because the governments have always done a lot of welfare. In fact, if you look at India's growth model compared to China's, China followed ruthless capitalism. They gave no welfare to their people until, their per capita income was very high. China did that. We have never followed that ruthless capitalism. In fact, I begin my book by saying that it's really, like the fact that in America today, most youngsters there, they feel that socialism is a better model than capitalism. They have lost their faith in capitalism. And I begin the book by saying that, listen, I grew up in a socialist India of the 1980s. I know how bad that is. So there's no going back to that in terms of that. But I think that what we do know is that as I make the point in the book, that often government actions lead to greater perverse outcomes. And in India's case, as I've said, that the role of the government often has been to intervene to almost, or across the world, to accentuate inequality with the measures by supporting. Very important part about reform we should understand. Capitalism is about being pro-competition. It's not about being pro-business. It's a very important distinction people don't realize, that a lot of policymakers and government end up being pro-business. That's not capitalism. Capitalism is being pro-competition, pro-churn, for new people to rise, not for the old entrenched elite to stick on to power.
But if we talk about economic anxieties in India, how does that translate, you believe, into political preferences? Because one of the more fascinating aspects in a year where several democracies are going through elections, the United States is going through a period of economic prosperity, a real boom, most economic indices better than ever before, and yet the general impression is the incumbent president, Joe Biden, is most likely to lose.
Yeah.
Now, put that in the Indian context. India has been seen post-COVID to emerge as one of the stronger economies in the world. Does that make it easier to predict a re-election for Prime Minister Modi, as some would suggest? Or is there no correlation between economic anxieties and political preferences?
Broadly, in India's case, the data that I've done on this shows the following conclusion. So I did this data for my last book, in fact, Democracy on the Road. What it showed was that if you look at India, there have been 30 instances when a chief minister has presided over an economic growth rate of over 8%. 30 instances. In half of those instances, the chief minister lost their re-election. This never happens anywhere in the world. 8% economic growth over 5 years, half of the chief ministers lost the election.
Including Vajpayee in 2004.
Yeah.
Atal Bihari Vajpayee lost when the economy was on a high. Chandrababu Naidu lost
even
Andhra
now,
Pradesh.
Even Andhra Pradesh, I think there's an emerging consensus currently, which is that Jagan may well lose this election, even though Andhra Pradesh has done relatively well. It's been more pro-welfare, but has done relatively well. So in India's case, elections are much more complex than having a straight link between economics and politics. So I think that's link between economics and politics. Yeah, it's there. In India's case, I do believe that I know exactly what can lose you elections, which is high inflation. The moment you have high inflation, any country in the world, even one of Biden's problem has been high inflation. The credit I'll give to the Modi government is the fact that even though they keep, there's a lot of talk about high food prices and all that, generally inflation has been relatively well behaved. And one of the good things they did was that when you had this pandemic, they did not go wild with stimulus. A lot of countries around the world went wild with stimulus, which is what led to a massive inflation problem. India didn't do that. So generally inflation has been better. And I think that anti-incumbency would have been much greater had inflation been galloping at 8 or 9% rather than the 5%. But I think, as was pointed out earlier, inflation and rising food prices will always be cited in India because so many people are living at the margin. They'll always cite it as a factor when you do the polls.
So broadly, you're saying Mehengai is a more difficult problem for politicians, incumbents to handle than growth. You can grow at 8% and still lose an election.
Yes.
But if inflation was 8%, you'd be in serious...
You'd definitely lose in the election. I think that's what lost Narasimha Rao in 96. I think that we know it, like that onions make politicians cry, literally, right? Every election. So that's, yeah.
Let's talk about the cult of Mr. Modi for a moment, because you mentioned it in Democracy on the Road as well. Across the world, we are seeing the rise of the strongman politician. Do you believe that this rise of the strongman politician is here to stay? That, that those are the politicians whom people are able to identify with. And therefore, as Indian elections possibly get more presidential, the strongman leader has an advantage over someone else who may be more democratic in his or her functioning, but is not seen as that muscular strongman.
Again, I think that there is a certain sliver of India's urban middle class, and something again I wrote about, which is willing to make a trade-off, which is willing to say, hey, as long as I'm doing well, I'm willing to make a trade-off between the economy and democracy. There is a certain sliver of that urban middle class which feels that way. So that's what like feeds into it. But again, the travels this time reveal that if you speak to the average person, they're not thinking in these intellectual terms. They're like thinking about what is in it for me. It's very transactional.
They're not thinking about Samvidhan Khatre mein hai.
I mean, like, in terms of the fact that I didn't get that sense, that it's a very daily existential crisis is what I feel. It's not about thinking these intellectual debates which we love having out here. That's the feeling I got.
No, so have we become, and you've written about this, bit like the East Asian economies.
Yeah.
The East Asian economies said we are okay with a bit of authoritarianism as well as as long as we have economic progress. Is India also at that stage where maybe in audiences like this, maybe in most middle class audiences, you don't really mind a little bit of autocracy as long as you get economic progress? As long as my coastal road starts functioning in a year and not 5 years, I'm okay with it.
Yeah, I think there's a sliver of India which is like that.
It's only a sliver, you think?
Yeah, because I think when I traveled, I found that in rural India, they don't make these kind of, trade-offs a bit more.
There it's livelihood issue.
Exactly. There's much more livelihood issue that, like, thinking about that. And I think that there is a deep, there's a deep sense of their vote. They feel really proud of the fact that they can go out and vote. It's one thing they have, the one power they have. And I agree with the discussion that, I think that someone mentioned earlier, that we speak about the money part, we speak about this, but if, like the incumbent in India would always win if money was the big issue, because they always have, like more money. But the fact is that so many incumbents still lose. It's 50-50 or whatever, much higher than other countries. In the West and stuff at one point in time, and the 90% of incumbents would win re-election. In fact, this anti-incumbency now has become a global phenomenon. India's, I've seen it for many years.
But Mr. Modi is bucked anti-incumbency. 10 years in past, still the favorite to win. What, according to you, makes Mr. Modi distinctive? When you look at all these strongmen that you've written about across the world, or you've met, what makes Prime Minister Modi distinctive in a way?
I think that, as I said, that I think that there's a large base in India which views him as someone who is, you may agree or disagree, as someone who is sort of out there with no family, who's sort of going, working 18 hours a day, 20 hours a day, with no ulterior motive except, to like help the country. He never takes a vacation. That kind of image projection, I think, has helped in terms of the enduring appeal, especially when you look at, like, often the other side where, like everyone's out on vacation or...
No, but Manmohan Singh once told me, I met Dr. Manmohan. Dr. Manmohan Singh said, you keep writing about how Mr. Modi works 18 hours a day. I also used to work 18 hours a day, but you never wrote about it.
But Manmohan Singh never had any mass appeal. He could
so
not...
it's an emotional connect.
It's an emotional connect. It's an admiration for the work ethic in terms of what he does. And here's it's for real, because if you look at the state leaders too, the state leaders which have been successful in India, they have a very similar kind of work ethic. In fact, many of them are also single, as I pointed out in that book. So I think that there is a certain connection with that work ethic as far as India is concerned, and I think that's what has helped him endure this, long term.
In a sense, being single is a political advantage, that means, in India.
Yes.
So that advantage should also work for Rahul Gandhi then, right?
Yeah.
What works for Narendra Modi should work for Rahul Gandhi as well. If you're saying being single,
I'm sure that it's a package of things in terms of, like it's an image thing. Like no one factor determines Indian elections. Like similarly, as far as personality cults go, there are a whole bunch of factors which go into that.
But when you look at from your vantage point at the state of the opposition, do you see the opposition being able to capitalize on what you seem to be suggesting already is creeping anti-incumbency? The factors could vary state by state, but there is creeping anti-incumbency, rural distress, unemployment, a serious crisis, inequality. Has the opposition simply not been good enough? Or have they not been allowed to be good enough in India?
But it's always a combination of both, as you know. I mean, like I think, like you point out, my role here really, Rajdeep, is an observer. I've gone out there, I've seen what I can. Whether this translates into actual votes, doesn't translate, it's beyond me to be able to try and predict that. This is the journey of India. I know at the end of it, we are left with no choice, but everyone wants, what's your number, because that's all they want. But for me, this is a journey of India where I've learned a whole bunch of things as I've done this. And yes, as an investor, I bring it back to, okay, what are the risks? My entire thing as investor is, are there upside, are there downside risks? How do you position for that? I think that's the way that we approach the game.
Let's look at these upsides and downsides.
Yeah.
For a long time, a lot of Indian voters seem to want stability and continuity above all else. Are coalition governments bad for markets? Would markets be spooked if the BJP ends up, for example, less than 250, dependent on coalition partners, or almost unpredictably the opposition is able to cobble together a government? Are coalition really bad for markets? Because they've been very good for reforms. Some of India's biggest reforms have taken place during coalition governments.
Yeah, but I think that those reforms happened when India literally had a gun on its head, right? Which is the fact that we were bankrupt, we needed to reform. Most countries carry out economic reforms when they go bankrupt. That's what we're seeing around the world as well. I think that there's no doubt that if the BJP gets below 250, there'll be an initial big knee-jerk negative reaction on the market. I mean, if that black swan scenario kind of thing happens, if the BJP gets less than 250, the market will be down 10 to 20% in a day, in a flash.
10 to 20% in a day?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of it'll be down that much. I can tell you that if it gets less than 250, that will be the scenario. But it's not the base case scenario of anyone just now. I don't think anyone that. But if that were to happen, you would get an instant reaction. And then it depends again about what happens. In 2004, something similar happened. Let's just play that out, tease that out. But then the markets recovered very quickly. Why? Two factors. One, that there was a global emerging market boom which was happening. Two, that because they appointed people like Manmohan Singh and Chidambaram at that point in time, they were generally seen to be okay. But India got lucky. Because we had a big emerging market boom, we rode that. This time, the risk I see is that if you get below 250, how will the verdict be interpreted? If it's interpreted as being that, hey, we need to go back to doing a lot more welfare, spend on that and stuff, I think that it could be a much longer haul out of that. I'm very positive on India in the long term. I think that the fundamentals look great. But yeah, this is the most expensive stock market in the world currently. It is also the reason why foreign investors have been skittish about coming in. The on-the-ground environment still sort of needs to be improved a lot for foreign direct investment to come in. We are attracting FDI as a share of the economy today of just over around 1% of GDP. When China and all were booming, they were doing 4% of GDP, in terms of how much foreign investment as a share of the economy was coming in. So there's a lot more work which needs to be done. And the other thing which I wrote a piece in the FT about this a month ago, never take growth for granted or never take economic success for granted. I cited 5 examples there of countries which were seen as these, great superstars 5 years ago. And today they are seen as breakdown nations.
Give me an example.
Canada has seen the worst in terms of economic performance of any developed country in the last 10 years or so. Germany was seen as a big economic star. In terms of it, it's fallen off. South Africa, Chile, these are all countries which at some point in time were seen as very good. Chile was seen as the big star of Latin America, fallen off the radar. So in terms of, we just need to be sort of, take it 3-4 years at a time. But generally, I feel still constructive, but you've got to be careful about it.
So how important is having a stable government?
Stable,
is stability the critical factor? Does India need at the moment to ensure that economic growth moves to the next level, a stable government with a strong leader, which is one narrative? The other narrative is in a diverse country, you need to accommodate, build federal structures. Which is the best model for India?
No, the best model for India is a government which truly believes in reducing the role of government in people's lives. I think that is what the key is. Whether it's stable or coalition, I can point out like both to you, and something which I've also said in my public utterances earlier, that how do you create better business confidence in terms of it? How, for foreigners or for domestic people? one thing that I've written about extensively, which is I think the extensive use of investigative agencies or giving them too much power has deep consequences, I think, as far as investment is concerned. So there's an economic consequence to that. It may be a good political tool. There's an economic consequence to this. Those are the kind of things I believe are more important for business investment and other things to keep picking up, rather than this notion about that. Yeah, sure. So whichever government is willing to focus on that, I think will be better for India's long-term growth prospects.
Because one of the debates in this election campaign has been over the economy. You've got the opposition saying that what we are seeing in the guise of faster economic growth is actually cronyism. Taking off from what you said, that there are a few billionaires who benefited hugely post-COVID, but the lives of people at the bottom of the pyramid have not changed. We also have reports of a number of Indians who've taken their golden visas, moved to Dubai, long distance nationalism, looking, can I get a Portuguese visa? And those numbers are also increasing. So there seemed to be the Modi government which says we want to reward wealth creators. And in some way the opposition is saying, all very well, you want to reward wealth creators, but it cannot result in cronyism and concentration of power. Which of these narratives do you find more compelling at the moment?
No, I think that I'm optimistic on the Indian economy, but I think that there's stuff which is going on which needs corrective things.
Is there a real threat of cronyism?
I think that yes, in India's case or in any emerging market, there is always a case in terms of that. The previous government, the cronyism was out of control, you can argue, in terms of what happened 10 years ago. That's why you got the Modi wave after that, I think, because of that. So I feel that there are shades of grey here. I know you want to define this as opposition versus government, but as far as I'm concerned, as an investor, I think there's enormous amount of wealth creation in India. It's great, but I also am mindful of the fact that if it becomes too skewed, what happens in terms of it? And I think that in the last 5 years, there are lots of good billionaires who've come up in India in sectors such as manufacturing. But when I look at the data to me and tells me that billionaire wealth as a share of the economy today is 25%, and no other country in the world has that, I do get a bit concerned about that.
No, so actually I wanted the debate to be around what your book now says, which is what went wrong with capitalism. Is it that capitalism over time, particularly in the last 25 years, built these crony capitalists, built oligarchies, which failed to then ensure what you call a truly free and fair competition? Governments in turn responded by ensuring large-scale welfare measures or subsidies for the poor, but eventually have failed to address the real issue of growing income inequalities.
Yes, in terms of that's true, but I'm saying income inequality has been a consequence of government intervention. That even in America, a lot of the government intervention tends to be pro-incumbent. The more regulation you do, who benefits? The established businesses. It prevents new businesses from entering because the cost of regulation is a lot. In America's case and stuff, for a new person to set up business, the cost is enormous amount of cost is required to do that. So what I argue in the book is that capitalism did not fail, it was ruined.
No, when you say capitalism did not fail, it was ruined. Let's look at the Indian example. And you spoke about how you and I both grew up in a socialist India.
Yes.
And at times it seems that we are going back in time with larger and larger governments. They talk about maximum government, maximum governance, minimum government, and just the opposite happens. And more people are dependent then on government subsidies, on government SOPs, what Prime Minister Modi calls Revdis or freebies. But the truth is all parties are doing it.
Yes.
And they believe it's a winning ticket. When the Ladli Behna scheme, 1,200 rupees to women in Madhya Pradesh wins you an election, the temptation is that all parties will do it. Now the Congress says we'll give 1 lakh to a woman per year under the Mahalakshmi scheme. Do you think that's healthy? Or
No.
do you think that's exactly the mistake that India would make in the future?
Yeah. That's absolutely correct. As I sort of said so, in fact, in the interview to, I think it was Rahul last year in New York, that competitive populism is the biggest risk that India faces. We don't have the money for it in terms of that. So competitive populism is the single biggest risk that India faces to its growth story.
But the fact at the end of the day is Indian politicians need to win elections. So every 5 years I've got either a Vidhan Sabha, Lok Sabha. So how do I get out of this cycle of competitive populism? Politicians will tell me that, look, what other option do I have in a country where, as you said, millions still live on the margins? but ensuring that they get some benefit, the Labharti work. Mr. Modi says that's the ticket to his power.
Yeah, but in the end, many politicians do that and still lose elections. So I'm not sure it's the winning ticket. But I think that the whole issue here is, Rajdeep, which is that how in India do we make sure that the role of government in this country goes down? That's what China's success story was. People think of China as a big communist nation. What China did successfully was to make sure that the role of government kept going down. And now under Xi Jinping, that's been increasing. And that's the reason why I think in China, the growth story also has petered out.
So what's the prescription? You know, as I said, neither of us are politicians. And
Yes.
when you speak to politicians, they want to win elections. How do you get out of the trap? The Prime Minister talks a lot about it, that, you know, I don't want to worry. I'm not worried about the cycle of election. And he has taken over the years some bold decisions at
Yes,
times,
yes.
Which to his credit. But at the same time tends to succumb at election time, some would say, to populism. The price of petrol, for example, is not determined often by global prices anymore, but whether there's an election round the corner. So given that, how does India or any Indian politician who wants to win an election break out of this cycle?
It's very difficult to do so, but you have to get the balance correct. At the end of the day, you have that much money available. How much do you spend on building a better road? Right? How much do you spend on giving people better services rather than just throwing money at people? It's about getting the balance correct. Broadly, in the last 5 years, I would say this government has got the balance correct in terms of the spend. If you look at subsidies as a share of the economy and all, it's generally been restrained. It's not gone out of control. But as I said, that the Indian electorate demands many things. So my fear is that if they end up underperforming in this election, let's say, then even if they come back to power, how will they interpret that verdict? Will they interpret that verdict? Therefore, this election becomes so interesting, like in some ways, right? If the BJP comes back to power with 300 seats or more, I think then life is normal for the markets and generally for economic policy. It's more of the same in terms of what you do. If there's a scenario where the BJP by any chance drops below the majority mark of 272, but even if it comes back with 240, 250, enough to form a government, how does it interpret that verdict? Does it interpret the verdict that we did not do enough for welfare, we focused too much on that? Or could it be just something as simple, which is that, yes, they did reasonable, but when you created so much hype and expectations that people said, yeah, they've done it, but maybe not as much as they're saying they've done it. So I think that...
Is that one of the dangers, though, Ruchir, going ahead, these rising expectations?
Yeah.
You see, the middle class is increasingly aspirational. Every Indian wants a better life for his or her child than he or she had. And no government can fulfill that often in a finite amount of time. Is that going to be a challenge in India and indeed across the world, but particularly in a country like India?
Yeah,
the Prime Minister talks of Viksit Bharat, great dream, but at the end of the day, the reality is that a woman has to walk 5 kilometers for a pail of water.
Yeah, but this is a global phenomenon again, because I think that Mr. Modi may have bucked this, but across the world today, the approval ratings of leaders is at a record low across the world in terms of that. So there's a lot of negativity also now being spread, I think, through social media. That one of the reasons anti-incumbency across the world has picked up is that there's so much negativity now which is spread through social media, which is that anybody does anything, they get taken down instantly on that. I mean, what else explains the fact, even in America's case also, I think the problems are deeper, that you have social media, but you also have problems of inequality, which is there, that I may be doing okay. So in India, all these debates take place that the poor person, their poverty level in terms of in India has dropped and the poor is better. But when you see the other person doing that much better, you have those images beaming to you, that also creates a sort of frustration, which is the fact that, yeah, but I may be doing okay, but look at the other person in terms of what's that person doing.
But we had Fareed Zakaria earlier on this pop-up, and he seemed to suggest that across the world, cultural politics was becoming more and more important. People were identifying themselves, their core identity, even as a white American, today looking at the other. That othering seems to be taking place in India as well. In India, in the context of possibly Hindu versus Muslim. Do you see more of that happening, and is that worrying? That in a country with the third largest or fourth largest Muslim population in the world, that is one of the risks that India has. The fear that these divisions could widen in the years ahead?
I know that's a fair, but luckily, I'll say one of the encouraging things of traveling in India, and you have done it too, is that way I feel India's social fabric is much stronger. I don't see that tension at a village level. I still see one of coexistence. At a village level, as you know, that, like there'll be a separate Dalit basti, there'll be a separate basti, like a separate concentration of Muslim people somewhere. I still see a lot of, maybe I'm an optimist and maybe that's the thing, I still see a lot of peaceful coexistence. I think this vitriol is much more an urban middle class phenomenon.
You're saying something important. You're telling me this communal poison that enters our society is much more urban middle class.
Yes.
Outside these urban middle class pockets, out there in rural India, there is far greater a sense of coexistence.
Yes, and I've seen very little change in that in the last 25 years of my travel.
If I were therefore to ask you as we come towards the end, the top 3 risks for India going ahead in the next 5 years, we won't even go 10.
Right.
The 3 things that India should be concerned about, what are those top 3 risks?
Right. I think that the biggest risk as far as India is concerned, firstly, you have the election. That if, let's say, the BJP ends up underperforming the market's expectations, in terms of how will that verdict be interpreted? The big risk will be if it is interpreted that you need to do much more welfare, much more of that, and that having a development-oriented strategy doesn't really cut it. I think the balance shifts on that. That is a true risk as far as India is concerned. I think the second risk for India also happens from a global perspective is the thing with China. It's a very tricky situation with China just now in terms of what we are going through. And one thing we have to be very careful about is, like how do you keep as many friends as possible? Sometimes I feel we almost get too aggressive, like in the neighborhood and stuff. How do you keep, because every single successful economic model in the world has relied on a lot of trade with your neighbors. That's really been something which is, like essential out there. And then in terms of, so I really see these 2. I mean, I know you asked for 3, but I see these 2 as big. But for me, the biggest challenge is that come June 4th, how will that election result be interpreted if by any chance the BJP does underperform the very strong consensus today? You're saying this is an interesting election, but if you just look at the market behavior or everywhere, they are behaving as if this election's over. That, it's like, let's move on, let's wait till what the next budget's going to be. So I think that that's really what, and then that'll be another risk if you ask me, if you're saying a third one. Let's say the BJP does much better than expected. Let's say they get, 330 or whatever. Then the risk is that the expectations of the first budget of the new government will be very high. They will then, the market will be really like primed for the fact, you got 330 seats, show us in terms of all that you can do with that incredible verdict.
It's interesting you're saying that because you beat Congress leaders and they say, the markets have boomed when we've been in power as well. Why are you forgetting the years we had, especially between 2004 and 2008? It was only the global financial crisis that sent the economy into a bit of a tailspin.
Yeah, but the global economic boom is what took them on the upside,
Sure. So, politicians tend to cherry pick.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying that, do you believe there is a broad consensus, and you see it across state governments as well, that actually the future of India may not necessarily lie in who's in power in Delhi, but the kind of state governments that we have, because many of these states are the size of the United States, like in Uttar Pradesh, that the real strength of India or the weakness of India will lie in how these states grow and handle the economy in the next 5 to 10 years.
Very true. In fact, Mr. Modi used to say that a lot when he was in Gujarat, which I think is a script that, like in terms of, I'm not sure he believes in anymore, that competitive federalism could be India's real strength. I've not heard that term, but you brought it up now, and I think that that is something which would make me optimistic in India, that you have a lot of state governments competing with each other. So therefore, they now show up as delegations in Davos and New York, as state delegations. I think that this competitive federalism in India, how we can do more to promote that, I think would be the biggest boost to India's growth story.
In a sense, therefore, the biggest risks are, some states lagging way behind the others, presumably. That is going to be, it's not just income inequalities, but you travel to a Karnataka, Telangana, and then you travel to a UP, Bihar, Jharkhand. It's like different worlds at the
Or even
moment.
Maharashtra, as I said, next door.
Even within Maharashtra, there are different worlds. We can go 100 kilometers
Yeah.
away, and you'll go to Palghar and you'll find places falling off the map.
Yes, that's right. So I think this competitive federalism is something which I hope it re-enters the lexicon of Indian policy making. That could be the biggest strength for India.
But I think you've given us a useful. I hope what you're saying is looked at closely by governments, because all governments now swear by capitalism and claim to have an economic consensus around it, and then go and practice socialist practices in the way they implement their policies at times.
That's why, as I said, that capitalism should be pro-competition, should be pro-churn. It should not be pro-business or pro-incumbent.
Okay, let's conclude by celebrating India. You have been traveling across this wonderful country from the East Coast to the West. I've spent 7 weeks traveling across this magical country. What's the best thing, Ruchir, of being Indian, of traveling through India? What is it that depresses you the most? And what is it that reinforces your belief that India is the country to be in the future?
Undoubtedly, the warmth and hospitality, right? You can drive into a village in terms of it and the way people are welcoming. Anybody will give you a cup of chai anywhere. They will talk to you. And this is such a difference, which is that I can do this election trip in India, but let's say like in a Brazil or South Africa, I would never, ever be able to do this because it would be a security hazard. People would sort of mark you down. In India, you can travel with feeling totally safe and warm and welcome as you get into people's homes. I think that is the thing. The depressing state can be also the fact that how sometimes things don't change. That you go to Maharashtra today, and in all these other parts of Maharashtra that we went to, it seems as if you're still, stuck 20 years ago or something. There's been very little change that's happened. And even at a bit of a superficial level, one thing which is fun, which I've noted in 25 years of travel, the average time it takes you to go from point A to point B, which is, home to home in 2 cities, is unchanged for 25 years. It's still 50 kilometers an hour average speed, which is that you can drive through the expressway at some crazy speed, and the moment you enter any urban sprawl, there's so much development that's happened. By the time you get, the entire expressway time gained is lost. So the time taken it from city A to city B in India in 25 years, I'd go more than that. Even since a kid, when we used to travel, to our grandparents' home when we were based in Delhi or Bombay, it is unchanged.
But basically, it's faster to get from Noida to Agra. The problem is once you enter Agra. Same thing from Mumbai to Pune.
Yeah.
Fast to get to Pune. Problem is once you enter Pune.
Yeah, this great expressway they've built in Jaipur and stuff. The moment you enter Gurgaon, from there to get to central Delhi, good luck. Right? So that's...
Okay, we're going to end tonight because elections on my plate. We've got elections in a couple of weeks. I just wanted to know what's the best meal on your travels that you've had across India. Then I'll tell you mine.
By far, my favorite cuisine in India is Chettinad cuisine.
Terrific cuisine.
Which is, I've been very fortunate that, we used to have somebody in Madurai, like a very leading industrialist there. Unfortunately, he recently passed away. But I would try and engineer our election trips to somehow get to Madurai so we could taste Chettinad cuisine. So I think that's my favorite cuisine in India.
I had a crab omelette in Madurai,
Right.
200 meters away from Meenakshi Puram temple. And that's the genius of this country, where you will be fully veg when you're in the precincts of the Meenakshi Puram. 200 meters away you go, and you can have a crab omelette. But yes, Chettinad food is great. I had a terrific meal in Coimbatore. So when you go to Coimbatore, you've got to try the food there. And please have the tomato chaat. And
I've done that.
And the palak chaat
in Varanasi.
In Kashi Chaat Bhandar.
That I've done multiple times.
And next to him, he has a Pan Bhandar called Gama Pan Bhandar, which says, he claims, that inspired Amitabh Bachchan to start Khaike Pan Banaras Wala. So and he's got a little poster of Amitabh Bachchan in the shop as well. And everybody, there was a longer line before Kashi Chaat Bhandar than there is before a Salman Khan film. And that can only happen in India. And that too through a chaotic street when the traffic was impossible.
There we go. That's why we love this country.
That's why we love this country. That's why there is no country like India. Through all the chaos, this is a country which hopefully will continue to enthrall us and excite us in the years ahead. And hopefully June 4th will prove to be as enthralling and exciting. But for giving us a sense of what lies ahead, how the markets could respond, Ruchir Sharma, for your book, which we look forward to reading, What's Wrong with Capitalism. By the way, he'll be signing books outside. Thanks very much, Ruchir, for joining me on the show. Thanks.
Thanks, Rajdeep.
Thank
Thank
very
you.
much. Ruchir Sharma.